BlackRock has been warning about for years, since at least 2011. They put out this threat assessment or risk assessment for investors periodically. And one of the so-called threats that they've been concerned about is what they call resource nationalism, which of course refers to the incredibly dangerous situation when a country starts to treat its own natural resources as their own. When countries commit the ideological crime or the ideological error of imagining that they should have sovereignty over their own resources and that their own people should benefit from those resources, because of course the required understanding is that their resources do not belong to them and belong by default to multinational corporations and Western investors. Now, it is noteworthy that this sentiment was previously expressed by governments, by like the State Department and so on, back in the 1960s and 1970s. The U.S. and the West in general regarded any form of economic nationalism in the global South, in the Muslim world, in the Arab world, and so on, as a grave threat to American and Western interests. Now, this is being expressed directly by the private sector, by the OCGFC, by the new empire of capital. And this is indicative, in my opinion, of the evolution of power dynamics in the world. Power now is not that concerned about American or Western interests. They're concerned about the interests of multinational corporations and the global financial elite. And it's unacceptable to them if countries in the global South, particularly in Africa, start believing that they have or should have control over their own natural resources. Now, back in 2019, the country that had the highest rank, the highest risk of economic nationalism was the Democratic Republic of Congo. Note that this pertains specifically to the mining sector and the extraction of minerals. About a year later, the M23 rebels re-emerged after being more or less dormant since 2013. And I think we're all familiar with the violence and instability currently plaguing the DRC. Another country ranked as being an extreme risk of economic nationalism in 2019 was Venezuela. And since then, since 2019, there was an attempted coup, rigged elections, and sanctions against that country, creating an economic and humanitarian crisis. Russia was another country that was ranked as an extreme risk of economic nationalism. And I think we're all aware of the measures taken against Russia over the last couple of years. Now, there were a number of other countries back in 2019 that were ranked as high risk, not extreme risk, but high risk of so-called economic nationalism. And these included Turkey, Indonesia, Pakistan, Libya, Syria, Kazakhstan, and wait for it, Saudi Arabia. Other countries like Malaysia and Iraq were singled out for what they regarded as moves that they had made towards economic or resource nationalism, economic sovereignty, moves that they thought put them on a trajectory towards a high-risk status. Now, it should be obvious that being ranked as being at risk of exercising economic sovereignty is regarded by the OCGFC as not only a punishable offense, but it is something that they will move rapidly to preempt. And they have organizations like BlackRock, State Street, and Vanguard. They have at their disposal the powers of the state. All of the powers that the state has at their disposal are at the disposal of the OCGFC because they are entirely captured by the OCGFC. So what that means is that confrontation, negotiation, conflict, or diplomacy today is going to be primarily carried out between the governments of the global South and Western private sector power, not between their governments and the governments of the West. Because imperialism today operates differently. Imperialism today is carried out by an a-national private sector. The owners and controllers of global financialized capital represent a collective emperor, a collective colonizing power that itself transcends any single state or grouping of states. They don't need the money now. They don't need the money and the resources that they extract from colonized countries to necessarily flow to this country or to that country. They just need it to flow into their corporate accounts, their profit margins, their dividends, and so on. They don't need the U.S. to control anything, or the U.K. to control anything, or Europe to control anything. They just need their investors, their shareholders, their companies to control things. These officials of the empire of capital are not particularly interested in the standard of living of America, or of the U.K., or of Europe, and so on. They have taken the logic of neoliberalism, and they see no reason why Western countries should be exempt from that logic. Their societies can be bankrupted and exploited too. Their populations can be oppressed and enslaved too. Their countries can be sabotaged and destabilized too if it's profitable. And the converse is also true. The countries of the global South can improve their standard of living. They can be less exploited, they can be stable, and so forth, as long as the OCGFC, the Western-based OCGFC, are profiting. Economic nationalism, however, resource nationalism, poses a threat to this new imperialism because it has the potential of cutting them out of the picture. And if they think they're going to be cut out of the picture, then they'll just burn the picture. They will mobilize state power, which includes national militaries, intelligence agencies, and so-called international institutions like the UN, the WTO, and so on. They will mobilize those to terrorize the economies and the societies of any country that they think is trying to shut them out. So whenever you see military action being taken, or whenever you see what appears to be subterfuge or subversion or covert destabilization in a country in the global south, and that indicates to me that that's a country whose government has diplomatically and strategically failed to negotiate its sovereignty with the OCGFC. Because just as in the past, American power, Western state power, could not be ignored, could not be safely defied in a bold and unilateral, uncompromising manner without it resulting in an invasion or a coup or an assassination. So too today, the owners and controllers of global financialized capital and entities like BlackRock and Vanguard cannot be ignored. They cannot be defied, and they cannot be entirely sidelined without disastrous results. Like it or not, these are the power dynamics that exist in the world today. This is the new shape of imperialism and the new shape of anti-imperialism. You know, historically, colonization in the Muslim world, the technique of colonization included recruiting or coercing the collaboration of local authorities, local elites, local officials. Anti-colonization movements then tended to arise from the lower classes, from the grassroots, because elites were compromised. The elites were subordinated, but they were still the elites in the society. They were still the authorities. And the common people still respected that social order to one extent or another, and they still utilized and benefited from that social order, from that traditional authority structure in one way or another. This, combined with the fact that historically revolutions generally tend to be revolts by the lower classes, it fixed in our minds the idea that any sort of anti-colonization, anti-imperialist movement must be a grassroots uprising, or anyway, that it should at least begin from there, even if intellectuals and middle class and upper class elements eventually integrate into those movements. The idea is set in our minds that that revolutions are undertaken by the peasants, you know, basically marching with their pitchforks against the rich. Now, there's still an element of this thinking that's still true today, but the dynamics around that are different, and the strategy and the impact are different from the old days. Today, I would argue that for the global south, and certainly for the Muslim world, the most effective, the most efficient, the most impactful anti-imperialist struggle is not being led by peasants storming the palace, but rather it's being led by the palace itself. But they're approaching it very tactfully, very diplomatically, not in an overtly confrontational way, but more through negotiation and compromise. But not the kind of compromise, mind you, that reduces their sovereignty. Rather, it's the kind of compromise that increases their sovereignty without that sovereignty seem threatening to the OCGFC. Now, this may seem like a weak or an unsatisfying approach for an independent struggle. But you have to understand that until now, there never has been negotiation. Until now, our countries had to just take dictation. They didn't get to negotiate. They couldn't negotiate concessions from Western power. They just had to concede to Western power. But that's not what's happening now. That's not what's happening today. Now, our countries are setting terms and conditions, and they're making demands, and they're getting concessions. And this is only possible because countries like Malaysia, like Indonesia, like the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and BRICS are dealing with the OCGFC. We're involved in the transition of the global economy, the pivot of the global economy to the global south. The nature of that pivot is not being dictated by the West. It's being negotiated between our governments and the owners and controllers of global financialized capital. And we are securing greater and greater degrees of economic sovereignty and political independence thereby. Because again, demographics are on our side and time is on our side.